Welcome. My name is Caroline Johnson-Hodge, and I'm the chair of the Religious Studies Department. And it is my great honor to welcome all of you to this event in honor of Alice Laffey, our dear colleague and friend. I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you students, colleagues, and friends of Alice, and current students. I see all of those faces here in the crowd this evening. And a special welcome to our speaker, Professor Jennifer Koosed. My colleague, Mari Leonard Fleckman, will be introducing Professor Koosed in a few moments. I'm saddened to report that there are two people who are not here who we really wish could be here, and that is John and Jean Esposito. They generously donated the funds for tonight's event, and John taught here in the Religious Studies Department for 22 years, and he and Jean remained close friends of Alice's over the years. And John unfortunately contracted the flu just in the last couple days and is not well enough to attend. Shortly after Alice's death last summer, John reached out to us, and he and Jean expressed a desire to contribute funds to do something in memory of Alice. And so this is what we have done, and I want to thank my colleagues Alan Avery Peck and Mari Leonard Fleckman, as well as Benny Liu, for helping to make this evening happen. I would like to share just a few words about Alice before we get to the main event. Alice was a pathbreaker in her life. She earned a Master's of Divinity in 1973 from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and then a Doctorate of Sacred Scripture in 1981 from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and she was among the first women to do so. When she began teaching at Holy Cross in the 1980s, she introduced students to feminist biblical scholarship and ecology in the Bible long before these were mainstays in undergraduate classrooms, much less Catholic undergraduate classrooms. Alice taught at Holy Cross for 36 years, becoming somewhat of an institution within the institution. A colleague recounted a favorite memory of Alice walking down the hallway with a dog-eared copy of the statutes in her hands. She knew her statutes as well as she knew her scripture, and she did not hesitate to hold us to the standards that we had created as an academic institution. She was fiercely committed to the integrity of our work, and at her retirement, one colleague described her as the conscience of our department, and several of us in this room might extend that to her being the conscience of the institution while she was here. Alice's dedication to students was recognized by the college when she won the Mary Louise Marfuji Award for Academic Advisement in 2013, an honor she richly deserved, as her students would attest. Over the months since we lost Alice, I have heard many stories of mentorship, challenge, and call from Alice. People from all generations at the college, both colleagues and students, recount vivid recollections of a moment when Alice intervened in some way to give advice, relieve someone of worry, challenge someone to do more. Somehow, she kept track of a vast number of people and seemed to understand their various trajectories, and to nudge them along those trajectories as well, as many of us have shared with each other as we've remembered Alice at several events over the course of this year. It has been my honor to have been mentored, challenged, and nudged by Alice. And now I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Mari Leonard Fleckman, another one who I suspect would admit that she has been mentored, challenged, and nudged by Alice as well, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Caroline. Just a very brief note for students who are here. If you are here in Hellenistic religious resistance, you may sign in the very back. Any Hebrew Bible students, you can write up the response paper to this lecture and give glowing or whatever critiques you would like, and turn that in. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mari Leonard Fleckman. I'm an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department. As Alice's successor, as the Hebrew Bible Old Testament professor, and someone who counted myself as Alice's somewhat mentee and friend and also co-author, it's my distinct privilege to be able to introduce our remarkable guest speaker today, Professor Jennifer Koosed, who is chair of the Religious Studies Department at Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania. She is a prolific author. Among her books are Permutations of Kohelet, Reading the Body in the Book, Gleaning Ruth, a Biblical Heroine and Her Afterlives, which is one of my favorites, Reading the Bible as a Feminist, and most recently, Judith in the Wisdom Commentary series, which she co-authored with Robert Seasongood, her spouse. She's also the editor of several works, and her research interests include the books of the writings, Gender and Feminist Theory, Post-Structuralism, Animal Studies and Posthumanism, and the Bible in Popular and Political Culture. I will also say that Alice Laffey and I co-authored Ruth in this same series, and I can imagine Alice sitting right there next to you, very excited and then ready to talk your ear off afterwards. So without further ado, Professor Koosed.
I've got to get this on, right? Let's see. How's that? Is it on? Yes, it is. Oh my, okay. Thank you all so much for inviting me here to give the Alice Laffey Memorial Lecture. Thanks to the entire Religious Studies Department, to Benny Liu, who I knew could not be here tonight, but who first contacted me, Dr. Fleckman and Machado, who's I think sitting there in the back, who had me in their class today, for all of the students I met. Thank you to Kathy Barrett, of course, and to the Espositos. I'm so sorry I cannot thank them personally for this wonderful gift. It's been such an honor already to be here with you. So I never met Alice Laffey in person, yet she was very much a part of my first encounters with biblical studies. I began college many, many years ago as a physics major, dreaming of a career in theoretical physics. Then I came up against the cold, hard wall of calculus. Some of you may have experienced that. When I began my sophomore year, I was without direction. I did not know what I wanted to major in, let alone what I wanted to do with my life. I filled my course schedule with general education requirements, including a Hebrew Bible class. After only a few weeks in, I was hooked. I changed my major to religious studies, and here I am today, a biblical scholar and a professor at a small liberal arts college. Among the courses I took was a seminar on feminist interpretation of Scripture. Here is where I first met Dr. Laffey, in my syllabus and in my research. I met her through her words. In her book, An Introduction to the Old Testament, A Feminist Perspective, which she published in 1988, Dr. Laffey notes that for 7 years of graduate school, she, quote, studied the Bible in an almost exclusively male institution. The professors were men, mostly priests. The students were almost all men, mostly priests. The bibliographies contained, with few or no exceptions, the scholarship of men. The content of the scholarship was almost totally about men, end quote. Dr. Laffey then joined a small but determined and growing group of scholars who worked to change the situation. Their influence was such that by 1992, so you can do the math now, right? I could have a class that was so unlike her experience, a class about the Bible that was taught by a woman, The students were almost all women. The bibliographies were almost exclusively the work by women about women. Alice Laffey was the change she wanted to see. Of course, the revolution has not yet been won. Feminist rage is having a moment. There have always been women who have resisted the cultural pressures to turn anger inward and slowly go insane while watching the yellow wallpaper on their bedroom walls, right? Such bursts of rage, like Valerie Solaris's Scum Manifesto in 1967, and for those who are not into 1960s social movements, Scum stands for Society for the Cutting Up of Men. And then she shot Andy Warhol in 1968 to give a particularly strong punch, right, to her manifesto. Of course, we also then had Lorena Bobbitt, who cut off her husband's penis after he raped her once again in 1993, which has continued to resonate as witnessed by Lizzo's reference to the incident in her 2022 song, Girls. Rage has always punctuated popular culture and news headlines. Even so, our cultural moment seems to be particularly ripe for such angry response. Galvanized by the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the subsequent Women's March, and this is a photo from that march in 2017, roiled by the Me Too movement, people across the gender spectrum are standing up. No longer afraid of the dismissive stereotype of the angry, bra-burning feminist, women especially are embracing passionate, righteous rage in the face of oppression and violence, allowing it to fuel the fight for equality and justice. Smash the patriarchy, this time in needlepoint. Burn it all down, fueled by feminist rage. And in the midst of all these memes and clips, like the viral video of Anya Taylor-Joy's own manifesto of feminine rage, I don't know if anyone saw that as it made the rounds from just a few months ago, a painting from 1620 occasionally intervenes as a reminder that rage as a response to gender-based violence is not a 20th or 21st century American invention, but really has been part of the conversation all along. So this was on my Facebook feed. This painting, turned social media meme, was created by the young Artemisia Gentileschi while she was the subject of a very public trial around her own experience of sexual assault. Her subject here is the biblical Judith. So I know those of you in class have read the story, but for those who haven't, or at least haven't lately, the first part of the book of Judith tells the story of war. Nebuchadnezzar starts the war, appoints Holofernes as the general in charge of the campaign, and then Holofernes begins the rampage, conquering everything and everyone in his path. Finally, the Assyrian army reaches the hill countries, where the towns in Samaria and Judea have put up a defense, closing the passes. Holofernes lays siege, capturing the well and cutting off all the water to the first town blocking his path to Jerusalem, the town of Betulia. Or in English, something like Virginville. So I live about 10 miles south of Virginville, Pennsylvania, right? So people still name their towns this. The people of Betulia hold out for a while, but ultimately their suffering grows too much, and they beg the city's leaders to surrender. This part of the story is told in 7 chapters, almost a full half of the book. Where is Judith, the person for whom the book is named? Well, apparently she's been hanging out on her roof. When Judith hears that the town's leaders plan on surrendering to the enemy, this beautiful and pious woman takes matters into her own hands. She infiltrates the enemy's camp, charms the general, avoids his attempts at seduction, and instead incapacitates him with wine, takes his own sword, and cuts off his head while he is passed out drunk on his bed. The stuff of legend, the fantasy of the abused, the revenge of the oppressed, the rage of the battered woman. The apocryphal book still intrigues with its steely heroine who manages the most grisly of actions with the most elegant poise. Through the ages, Judith has fired the imagination. There is a significant amount of art, literature, opera, music that takes her story as its theme, even as she's been at the center of questions and controversies. Originally part of the Bible for Greek-speaking Jews, for reasons now lost to us, Judith was not included in the Jewish canon that came into its final form in the 1st or 2nd century. Originally part of Christianity's Bible. As Christianity split into denominations in the 16th century, its canonical status in Christianity also changed. Retained in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bible, albeit as deuterocanonical or secondary status, Protestants cut it out altogether. Perhaps this changing status is reflective of the theological, ethical, and historical debates to which she has been subjected, debates sometimes seeped in both sexism and anti-Judaism. Among her detractors, her duplicitousness, her sexual provocations, and her violent actions are all aspects of quote-unquote moral turpitude. Those are the words of a 19th century commentator who condemned her. She has challenged the very meanings of masculinity and femininity, even as she conforms to stereotypes of the femme fatale. Maybe male commentators are worried that they too will lose their heads to a woman as beautiful as she is deadly. As one of the few biblical books that is named after its female protagonist, and here she joins the ranks of Ruth and Esther, she has also come to the attention of feminist interpreters, who are also divided in their assessment of her and have asked, quote unquote, what shall we do with Judith? And that was Pamela Milne. Tonight, I'm less interested in what we should do with Judith and more interested in what we have done with her. Specifically, how she's been the vehicle for the expression of feminist rage across the centuries. So I will begin first with a deeper look at Gentileschi, her story and her art, then to the dancer Martha Graham and novelist Margaret Atwood, and then finally back to the visual arts. I want to end with an examination of Judith's breasts. I hope that's okay. Okay. If not, the lecture will just be a little shorter, right? Here we go. Gentileschi was a gifted child whose father was an artist. So this is her own self-portrait. She had opportunities that many other girls in the 17th century simply did not have. Orazio Gentileschi, her father, mentored her until he felt that her talents surpassed his training. At which point, he hired another artist and family friend, Agostino Tassi, to be her tutor. After repeated attempts to get her alone, Tassi finally cornered her in her bedroom and raped her in 1612. She was 18 years old. He then used a combination of promises to marry her and intimidation to gain sexual access to her several more times before it became quite clear that he had no intention on following through on any promise. The Gentileschi family pressed charges, and a highly public and scandalous trial began. A trial for which the court transcripts still exist. Can you believe that, right? 400 years ago, we still have these court transcripts. As you can imagine, Artemisia's reputation was called into question as part of Tasi's defense. She already wasn't a virgin. She was a quote-unquote insatiable whore, and so was her mother and her aunt. And he never had sex with her anyway. Defense moves eerily familiar, right, to our 21st century ears. The presiding judge was not sympathetic to Gentileschi's claims, and he ordered the young woman to submit to a gynecological exam to see how long ago her hymen had been broken. And in case you're curious, you can't tell that kind of thing. I immediately texted my sister, who's an OBGYN, and she was like, no, you cannot do that. He then also subjected her to thumb screws to test her honesty. I guess the 17th century version of a rape kit examination and a lie detector test. Tasi was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 8 months in prison. Although he had marshaled a number of witnesses to verify his accounts of Gentileschi's promiscuity, the prosecution countered with witnesses to whom he had bragged about his sexual conquest. He was convicted by his own big mouth. Orazio subsequently sued him for perjury. Throughout it all was the uncomfortable truth that Tasi himself had already been accused of sex crimes, incest with his sister-in-law, and even implicated in an attempt to kidnap and murder his own wife. So this was not a man of fine, upstanding character. And yet, the judge had been more inclined to believe his version of the events until other male witnesses destroyed his credibility. We can all imagine the feelings experienced by this young woman. In part, even if we have not ourselves been the victim of sexual assault or the subject of a highly public trial, both dramatic and salacious, we have read plenty of accounts of people who have. We can also imagine her feelings because she left a record of them. Not just the court transcripts, which certainly express some of what she was experiencing and feeling, but also in the work, Judith and Holofernes, which she began painting during the trial and finished shortly thereafter. In many ways, the encounter between Judith and Holofernes in the story, in the biblical story, is a rape story gone awry. The threat of rape is present in the text at multiple levels. The Assyrian army threatens to violently penetrate Virginville against its will. The townspeople very much fear being defeated by the Assyrians because rape is then and now a weapon of war. And the women are bound to be raped when the Assyrians breach their defenses. The townspeople also express fear that they will be subjected to slavery and the sexual subjugation that always accompanies that state. Judith herself may be fearing her own rape. There are good reasons a reader may imagine for Judith to fear for her own safety. But Judith herself does not seem to be motivated by personal fear. Before Judith leaves the protective walls of her town, she prays to God, invoking the story of Dinah's rape by Shechem in Genesis 38, so an earlier story of biblical rape. Rather than likening herself to Dinah, Judith actually identifies with Simeon, Dinah's brother and righteous avenger of her sexual assault. Judith was a popular subject for Baroque artists, and it was this scene that was painted more than any other. Judith may have been a beautiful woman, a perennial favorite subject of artists then and now, but few could resist setting her feminine beauty against the gruesome image of beheading, a sort of Beauty and the Beast. Sex and violence have always been popular. Over and over, Judith is depicted holding the general's bloody head, either in process or soon after disarticulation. In this sense, Gentileschi's portrayal is no different, than the hundreds that have come before and since. However, in other ways, her portrait is a marked break with other Baroque depictions of Judith cutting off the general's head. Compare Gentileschi's 1612 version, which is here, with the other most famous depiction of the same scene, Caravaggio's, who painted his Judith about a decade before Gentileschi painted hers. Whereas Caravaggio's Judith is tentative, even demure. Wait, does that work? Yes. So look at the expression on her face, and she's kind of standing back, like she's not quite sure she knows what she's doing with this sword. Gentileschi's Judith, does that go back? Yep. Is going about her task with grim determination. Again, look at the look on the face. Caravaggio's Judith stands back, her enslaved woman behind her, whereas Gentileschi's Judith is close, and her enslaved woman is actually on top of the drunk general. Her Holofernes may be drunk, but he is not wholly incapacitated. His eyes are open, his face is flush, and he is at least weakly trying to push away Judith's unnamed slave. Compare as well the painting Gentileschi's father painted of Judith. Pretty different, right? Right. The act of beheading has passed, and the two women are cradling Holofernes' head, almost like a little baby, I think. Perhaps putting it in a bag, but that's unclear. Holofernes' face is almost peaceful. And unlike his daughter's picture, which is full of energy and movement, Arazia's figures are still and quiet. There is no ragged, torn skin. There is no blood in this picture. There are many, many ways to read this painting, right? After all, Judith's cutting off the head of Holofernes was a very popular subject for artists, especially in this era. Both Caravaggio, whose work was highly influential on Gentileschi's own because, well, Caravaggio, and Gentileschi's father had tackled the subject in the years preceding Gentileschi's first rendition. Perhaps this was just next on her docket, right? And she would have painted it whether or not she had been raped. Perhaps knowing how others would connect her own experience of sexual violence to Judith's, she painted Judith and Holofernes to capitalize on the publicity, because this was a very, very public trial. Everybody was talking about it. So in a sense, we've all played right into her hands by connecting the two. For ever since the critical re-evaluation of Gentileschi's work in the 20th century, the rape and the trial has become the quote-unquote axis of interpretation of the artist's work, in the words of art historian and feminist critic Griselda Pollock. Art historian Laura Bendetti has critiqued this trend in the recent reception of Gentileschi's work as overly invested with the contemporary issues and personal biases of her critics. Well, guilty as charged. I do not deny that this is precisely what I'm doing here. I am, in fact, overly investing this work with contemporary issues. Gentileschi was a complex human being whose motivations were equally as complex. She was a great artist whose work transcends any particular individual experience or personal intention she may have had. I do not want to reduce her paintings to an expression of proto-feminist rage against the patriarchy. At the same time, there's a reason why these paintings, especially infused with the knowledge of her story, resonate so strongly with people today. So strongly that over 400 years later, a woman can pick up this painting and throw it out into the social media sphere, and we all know exactly what she means. Martha Graham. So if you're taking notes, right? Second part. Martha Graham was a groundbreaking dancer and choreographer. Any dancers in the audience? Dancers? Do you have a dance here at Holy Cross? Oh, nice. She was named by Time magazine Dancer of the Century, right? Not just the year, but of the century. And she's credited with the very creation of modern dance. She founded her dance company in 1926. Through this company, she developed a unique vocabulary and a signature style, distinctly American. And she frequently chose as her subject notable women from classical and other mythologies and the Bible. At a particularly tumultuous time in her career and in her personal life, Graham read the book of Judith. Recently married to fellow dancer Eric Hawkins, the two had a passionate but tormented love affair. Hawkins was the first man to join Martha Graham's dance troupe, and their intense and unstable relationship was both personal and professional. They diverged in artistic vision, and their ambitions competed and clashed. In 1949, Louise Kahn and the Louisville Orchestra commissioned a piece from Graham, and she created Judith, a solo ballet in 5 acts. The piece premiered to great acclaim on January 4th and 5th, 1950. Following this success, Graham's dance company embarked on a European tour. Soon, however, she seriously injured her knee, and she was compelled to cancel the remainder of the tour. In the resulting tensions and conflicts with Hawkins, they fought. Their marriage fell apart. He abandoned her in London, soon founded his own dance company, and she, devastated, retreated to Santa Fe. While rehabilitating both knee and heart, she returned to Judith. In the figure of Judith, she found an expression of despair and rage, an expression of courage and the will to fight back. She emerged from her injury to perform the 25-minute piece again, this time in New York City, on December 29, 1950. For Graham, according to friend and collaborator Pearl Lang, quote, "Martha had to make that dance so she could cut off Eric's head," end quote. And she continued to perform the piece. She re-envisioned it in 1962 as The Legend of Judith and added a dance partner. And then Judith in 1980. All right, so she redid this piece 3 times. And not just Eric Hawkins' head rolled. When Hawkins left her company, Bertram Ross was invited to join as Graham's, as he put it, Hawking's substitute. Right? So that's certainly how he understood himself. Graham had a romantic interest in Ross, but as he had made quite clear, he was gay, and he did not reciprocate. Biographer and choreographer Agnes DeMille notes that, quote, "Martha responded to Ross's rejection by inventing for him in various ballets every kind of tortured death in the calendar of horrors. And these he was forced to enact on the stage with her fervid participation. She beheaded him, stabbed him, poisoned him, beat him, castrated him," end quote. Expressing over and over her rage at Hawkins and her frustrations at Ross himself. So this is, of course, Martha Graham as Judith, and this is in 1968, so this is The Legend of Judith, and there is poor Bertram Ross. Judith becomes a conduit to express all the fury she felt toward her husband, but since he was also a dance partner and competed with her for attention and acclaim, and he did, these were 2 very big egos, her anger at him was not just personal, but also an expression of her artistic struggles as a woman, fierce and new in the world of professional dance. Decades later, Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood would capitalize on the conjunction of Judith and Graham in her novel Oryx and Crake, part of the Mad Adam trilogy. Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy is a dystopia. Have others read this? Oh, go read it. Go read it. Put that on your summer reading list. I know you have one, right? It's a dystopia that depicts a not-so-distant future where large transnational corporations control society. Commodification and corporate greed are the prevailing ethos. Cultural collapse and ecological disaster are on the horizon. Several main characters end up at a mid-level arts college called Martha Graham Academy. The school had been founded in better times, right, when people cared about the humanities, as a humanities academy with an emphasis on the performing arts. However, in a world where only scientific knowledge matters, and even then only when it can be turned into profitable products, the school now lacks reputation, money, and enthusiasm. Its classes are small, its physical plant falling apart. At the center of the campus is a statue of Martha Graham in her acclaimed role of Judith. Atwood writes, it's up there, but I'll read it for you. Martha Graham Academy was named after some gory old dance goddess of the 20th century who had apparently mowed quite a swath in her day. There was a gruesome statue of her in front of the administration building in her role, said the bronze plaque, as Judith, cutting off the head of a guy in a historical robe outfit called Holofernes. Retro feminist shit was the general student opinion. Every once in a while, the statue got its tits decorated or steel wool glued onto its pubic region. Parents were always objecting to this statue. Poor role model, they'd say, too aggressive, too bloodthirsty, blah, blah, whereupon the students would rally to its defense. Old Martha was their mascot, they'd say, the scowl, the dripping head, and all. She represented life, or art, or something. Graham, as Judith, becomes a site of commentary on women, art, and power in Atwood's trilogy. Graham's statue in this novel both attracts and repels the students who have come to her school. They both vandalize it and defend it, reflecting their society's ambivalent attitudes toward female power. The vandalizing of her statue, targeting her breasts and pubic region, highlights the rampant sexism and misogyny of the students. Juvenile, puerile behavior, to be sure, but puerile behavior with a particularly sharp point. Mad Adam's world has lost the transformative and subversive power of art. It has no respect for the female body, and as the earth hurtles toward ecological disaster, it gets pretty bad here in this novel. No respect for other animal and plant bodies as well. Even so, the statue stands. There's still a need for a Martha, right? Somebody with the strength and vision to express the power of the female body, and still a need for Judith, someone with the courage and the wisdom to cut off the head of Holofernes and every other toxic example of destructive masculinity wedded to military, political, and theological power. Atwood's world, and if you've read any of her work, you know she's always also talking about our world, right, is still in need of that retro feminist shit. Maybe it's just me, and you can tell me if it is. But when I imagine this statue of Martha Graham as Judith as described by Margaret Atwood, I picture a naked figure. Perhaps because of the focus on the decorated breasts and the steel wool pubic hair. Yet, Graham danced Judith fully clothed. And Judith herself in the text remains clothed. Except, I suppose, in the section where she changes from her widow's weeds to her rich and beautiful attire. Even so, Judith's body, especially Judith's breasts have attracted a lot of attention throughout the ages. The naked breast has been a site of struggle of late. Does anyone know this campaign, the Free the Nipple? Yeah, a few. When accused of violating Facebook's community standards by posting a picture of her breastfeeding her new baby, Kelly Roman, in 2007, started a social media campaign to change Facebook's definition of obscenity. Soon after, Lena Esco filmed herself running topless in New York City, and then she made a documentary about it. Noting that men's nipples were never sexualized and therefore could be exposed, photographed, and posted at any time, for any reason, the Free the Nipple campaign argued for the desexualization of women's nipples, focused especially on pictures of breastfeeding mothers and the documentation of mastectomies. So these pictures were also targeted by Facebook, and they are both decidedly unsexy situations. These activists flooded the social media sphere and even spilled out IRL, as the kids say, right, in real life, as people took their shirts off all over the country and even all over the world. This picture is actually from the United Kingdom, from 2023, so just last year. They have a yearly Free the Nipple parade in March in Brighton. Well, not everybody wants to run around topless, right? Free the Nipple underscores several underlying issues around the sexualization of the female body, victim blaming for sexual assault. Sometimes people will write across their bodies, both men and women who participate in these, "I'm still not asking for it," right? And equal treatment under the law. All important for the shirted and the shirtless alike. While the tone of Free the Nipple is more playful than angry, the same cannot be said for this image, which was posted on Twitter, and when it was still called Twitter, right? And went viral in 2013. In Henan, China, accusations emerged that a school principal and a local official had taken 6 girls, ages 11 to 14, to a hotel room where they had raped them. Furious by both the incident and the slow response of the criminal justice system, feminist activist Yi Hayan went to the school brandishing a sign which read, "Director, take a room with me." Repeatedly attacked for her action, including a home invasion where she had to ward off her attackers with a kitchen knife. Can you imagine, right? Hayan went into hiding. So, academic and feminist activist Zhou, and that's who this picture's of, Zhou, wrote Hayan's words across her naked chest. The scissors, open and menacing, signal the right to fight back against sexual violence. She then threw this image out on Twitter as an expression of rage. Judith's breasts are not explicitly referenced in the biblical text, but this has not stopped artists from lingering over them. Right. In fact, several of the students in class today noted that despite our sexualization of Judith, she doesn't actually do anything terribly seductive or even very sexual besides, dressing nicely. In the early Christian tradition, Judith was considered a hero, right? A chaste exemplar, a triumphant liberator. However, her reputation began to tarnish starting in the 17th century. At the same time, Gentileschi and others were celebrating her as a warrior, victorious over Holofernes. Others start depicting her in more seductive and less celebratory ways. For example, in a book from 1615, by Joseph Sweatman, Judith is listed as one of the many women who ruined important men by using their feminine wiles. Right? Poor Holofernes, Crimea River. This theme of Judith as femme fatale gains traction and outpaces the other images of Judith by the 18th and 19th centuries. Gustav Klimt's paintings of Judith, completed at the beginning of the 20th century, exemplify this trend. Okay. So he painted this one first in 1901, and even has Judith and Holofernes right there in the frame. In this painting, you can see Judith is looking out of the frame straight at the viewer, right? She's looking straight at you. Her face is magnetic and voluptuous. There's even something a little bit perverse about it. Her breasts are partially exposed, at least one breast is exposed. Her face is so attractive that you may miss the severed head she holds. It's right there, right? Which is cut off by the frame of the painting, right? So it's barely noticeable and it's cut off. The focus of this work is on her as a seductive figure. She looks like she might devour the viewer next. In the second one, this one, which was painted in 1909, her face is turned as if she were in motion. Her breasts here are completely exposed. The head, and it is here, only partially visible in a bag. This is a far cry, right, from Gentileschi's Judith, who needed to roll up her sleeves, certainly before she got to work. In this painting, Klimt's Judith apparently just has to take off her shirt, right, before she gets started. The femme fatale expresses a common sexist fear about women, that they will use their sexual appeal for nefarious purposes, that they are beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Men are vulnerable, even defenseless, before a woman's charms. Whereas Klimt here invites and encourages the male gaze and the sexualization of Judith, this work by Asuma Morimura does precisely the opposite. Morimura is a contemporary Japanese artist, so he's born in 1951. And his subjects are often himself. That's actually him. But his work is not self-portrait in any simple or conventional sense. Rather, he often takes pictures of himself dressed up and posed as other figures from Western art and popular culture. He's got a whole series of himself as Marilyn Monroe, which is amazing, really, look it up. He also sometimes uses digital technologies to insert himself into other famous images, right? So it'll be the image and then it'll be his face. In so doing, his work is both a comment on gender as well as conceptualizations of East and West. In addition, his work is explicit in its critique of militarism and imperialism, much like the Book of Judith itself. In this self-portrait, it's the third in a series. So this is actually Judith 3. Morimura uses the template of Lucas Cranach the Elder's painting. And so just so you can see that here and what he's doing with it. This is a painting of Judith from 1537. Instead of a woman dressed in regal European Renaissance attire, like here, Morimura as Judith recalls a host of Japanese traditions and crafts. Most notably, the female impersonators, or onagata of kabuki. As with the onagata, Morimura never completely disappears. He is not Judith, nor even Cranach's Judith. Instead, he is still very much Morimura, posed as Cranach's Judith. And as such, he is neither wholly himself nor Judith, neither wholly male nor female, as one art historian puts it. Even such destabilization could be erotic, especially to an orientalizing male gaze. But any such prurient interest is assaulted by the spikes, covering Judith's breasts, right? Judith's nakedness is suggested here, but when you look at her breasts, she pokes your eyes out. Judith acted to avert the murder, rape, and pillage and desecration threatened by the Assyrian army. Her methods were underhanded, as befits the asymmetrical power relations between the two peoples at war and between a man trained in combat and an unarmed woman in his bedroom. Beheading is a very gruesome form of execution, precisely orchestrated to produce certain effects. There is no other form of death as psychologically troubling to a person. A disarticulated head arouses emotions that no other mutilation will cause. The head is both the place of the face, right, the premier bodily site of identification and connection, and the brain, the control center for the body. To take the head is to confound identification, connection, control. To take the head is to dehumanize. To take the head is also to castrate. Like many artists, Gentileschi returned to the subject of Judith many times, twice painting her in the very act of severing Holofernes' head. So this is the 1620 version. It is nearly identical to the 1612 version, except for a couple of points. First, the bracelet, which is actually one of Gentileschi's own. So in case you were worried that we were reading too much in terms of this identification, she wanted to make it clear herself. Gentileschi's portrait here also uncovers a variety of visual conundrums. Arms and legs radiate out from Holofernes' head in ways that are not entirely clear. What appendage is associated with what torso, whose limb belongs to whom? It is all motion and energy and uncertainty. In addition, Gentileschi seems to be reversing the flow of the general's blood. In Caravaggio's painting, the blood all streams downward, away from Holofernes and his assassins, right? You never worry when you're looking at that painting that her white sleeves, which is the color of the sleeves in Caravaggio's painting, you never worry that those white sleeves are going to get blood spattered. In Gentileschi's first painting, the blood flows away as well. But here in this 1620 painting, the blood spurts out in unpredictable ways, right? You see it here especially, right? It's going here, it's going here, it's going up here. It is threatening to splatter all over Judith's bare arms and to soak her richly textured dress. Literary and art critic Mika Ball makes much of this confused and confusing blood. Judith is what Ball calls an ideo-story, quote, a narrative whose structure lends itself to the receptacle or projection screen of different, often opposing ideologies which the narrative appears to emblemize, end quote. In the case of Judith, confusion is endemic to the story itself. Gender confusion especially, but also a kind of epistemological confusion, a moral confusion that bifurcates her reception into mutually exclusive trajectories. More than just the rules of the body's grammar had been violated as Judith's fingers lace through the damp hair of her enemy as she wrenches up his head, exposing his neck, and saws the knife across skin and sinew. Is it any wonder, as Ball suggests, that Judith, quote, scares many of us out of our wits, end quote? Is it any wonder that Judith, either in the middle of this act or soon thereafter, becomes an expression of righteous, activist, feminist rage? Alice Laffey did not rage, at least nobody's told me a story like that yet, Although I have heard the words fierce and righteous used to describe her. I like the little laughs there. Okay, maybe. She faced the Bibles and the world's injustices, perhaps also with rage, but also with a deep and abiding love. And this comes through so strongly in some of her last works, like her work on Ruth and in the essay she wrote, Her Last Lecture. She loved the Bible. She had a love of learning, a love of God, a love for her students, a love for the process of relationship, a love for Holy Cross. But I think, and I hope Dr. Laffey would agree, that rage can be an expression of love. Because rage and love are just aspects of the passion that drives us all to seek the good in this beautiful but broken world. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay. So my primary question is, while there are definitely examples of in your presentation where violence was necessary, are there other forms, less talking about the protests, more talking about the situation with the paintings, where they could take a more non-violent approach, or at least non-lethal violence, like instead of this, like maybe an expression of disobedience a bit more non-murdery?
Well, I do have to say, I hope you all don't get the message that you should go out and behead your enemies, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that most of the ways in which people are expressing their rage nowadays is not violence, right? There is a lot that is very painful, especially on social media. What do you call it when you cancel? There we go. Cancel culture, right, is often an expression of rage. Sometimes whisper campaigns, right, for powerful men who've committed acts of sexual violence or harassment. Those are also acts of quiet rage, at least. So there are many ways that people do express this rage that fall far short of murder. So thank you for letting me assure you that I'm not telling you to go out and kill people.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I was wondering if you could reflect more about the connection between sex or sexualization and violence, particularly how this image progressively has become sexualized in a way that perhaps the artist certainly didn't intend, and what that reflects about the way in which we see things, particularly acts of sexual violence.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that the Bible itself does not, I don't want to say it doesn't sexualize her at all, because it's very clear that she's using her beauty to get Holofernes into a compromising situation, but it doesn't sexualize in the same way that her image becomes sexualized, right? Especially as it kind of moves through the centuries. And I think part of that is connected to really the feminist movement. I actually think as women become more powerful and demand to be treated equally and with respect, you get this counter movement, right, of sexualization. And that sexualization is used to denigrate and dismiss, right? So it's almost like the more you have women standing up, the more you have this other element happening as well. So I think that's in part why this image really just flowers, right, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, especially.
thank you so much for that wonderful and rich talk. And I'm curious about the intersection here between the feminist rage that Judith embodies and sort of the colonial or post-colonial rage that she's embodied, taking into account sort of the imperial position that she's factored into.
And certainly that's one of the main points of this, right? Most of this artist's work is really pointed at an anti-military, anti-imperial, post-Japanese cultural context. Yeah, certainly in the Book of Judith itself, war and colonial conquest is very much wedded to a particular expression of masculinity. So many feminist commentators for a long time kind of skipped over those first 7 chapters, right? They can be kind of boring. You're kind of waiting to get to the main attraction, and that's Judith herself, who doesn't come in until chapter 8. But there's been a number of people, and we do this in our commentary too, who really focus on those 7 chapters and say, no, this is really important because this is where this connection between a particular kind of masculinity and militarism and imperial domination are forged together. And interestingly, since we're talking about rage, it's in those chapters, that section, that talks about rage all of the time, right? So Nebuchadnezzar is enraged, and so he decides to conquer all of the Mediterranean world, and then Holofernes is enraged, and so there's all of this rage, this male rage, actually, that is expressed in this book. And in some ways, Judith is the calmest person in the entire narrative, and it is her calm self-control that wins the day, right? And this is seen as the proper response to that kind of imperial rage. So it is actually interesting that she's been picked up to express rage herself, because she certainly doesn't express rage in the narrative. She is precisely positioned as the one who remains calm in the midst of all of this out-of-control anger, right? But of course, gender is a particular way of reflecting and refracting imperialism as well. And I think that's one of the things that Muramama is doing, right, in a lot of his work. He's not just a Japanese man, right? He's playing with all of the gender dynamics that, and embodying a lot of the gender inconsistencies that he's experiencing under imperialism.
I just wanted to thank you for noticing the chuckles when you said that Alice did not rage, yes. But especially for the way that you answered a while ago with regard to the idea that rage can be an expression of love. Because I was the target of many such expressions over the years. No, absolutely not. This is my point. Yeah. That it took a little while to learn how Alice operated, and I always wanted to avoid those kinds of incidents. But it always had to do with a thoughtless word on my part, or a clueless expression of an opinion. In the last few years of her life, I and another Jesuit would have dinner with her almost every week. But there were some hiatuses there where she wasn't interested in seeing us for dinner. And then it would be a moment of learning on our part, and we would be back with her fairly quickly. And as a matter of fact, the very last time that I saw Alice was one of those all is forgiven moments after having learned something from her rage. So I'm just glad that you picked up on that and made that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And going back to the first question, right? That's rage in its best expression and consequence.
I was glad you returned in response to a question to the central theme, which is Judith herself was not really expressing rage.
No.
She was the corrective
Right.
against violence and the rage of men
Right.
against women and innocent citizens.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to ask why the book gets edited out of the Protestant tradition and also the Jewish, but kept in the Catholic Bible.
Right.
Has there been a lot of scholarship on that?
There has been a lot of scholarship on that because, particularly for why it drops out of the Jewish canon, we simply don't know, right? And some people have proposed that she drops out because she's too radical. But if you know the Bible, there are a lot of murderous women running around who are included in the text. And so it doesn't make any sense that this one particular murderous woman would get lobbed off. Some have suggested that some of the Jewish practices aren't quite right in the book, but I don't really find that argument compelling either. Honestly, I think it's just because by the time the Jewish canon was coming together in the 1st and 2nd century, that this text only existed in Greek. And nothing that only existed in Greek made it in, because there was a kind of unifying, I would say. So Judaism was super diverse in the 1st century, but then it suffered all of these calamities. And as a response to some of that, I think it kind of, circled the horses, circled the wagons, if you will, and clamped down on a diversity that had been present before, right? So we're only going to read Hebrew texts now. I don't care if you don't know Hebrew. The sacred scripture is in Hebrew. For the Protestant canon, that's a little bit more documented, right? Because Martin Luther wrote a lot, and so he doesn't leave a lot to the historian to guess. But he actually really liked Judith in a lot of ways, but he found certain things troubling. Like there's all this weird history stuff that doesn't make any sense, right, in Judith. He found that a little troubling. And ultimately, he just excluded everything that was in the Catholic Bible that wasn't also in the Jewish canon, right? So he took the Jewish canon as the real canon, right, the original canon, and so got rid of everything in what's now called the Apocrypha, right? And so Judith just went with everything else, right? But Judith circulates still, continues to circulate in both Judaism and in Protestant Christianity, right? So it still shows up in art and literature, in storytelling, in sermon making, in ritual objects. So it never completely goes away in either Judaism or Protestant Christianity.
I am particularly grateful for your including the artists and especially Margaret Graham. That whole story was fascinating. The thing I find interesting is that not only is she calm, but this action comes as a result of prayer.
Yes, yes. And in fact, you can't, let's go to a picture of her cutting off a head. There we go. So in the biblical book itself, she's actually alone, right, with Holofernes. The woman she's enslaved is standing outside the tent. Holofernes, of course, has sent everybody away, and they actually talk about that a couple times, like she's completely alone. And then once he passes out and she lifts his head up, she prays, right? So you don't get that moment in these pictures. I don't know if there is a painting that shows her praying right before she whacks his head off, right? And I think that's really interesting, right? That the artist wants to move very, very quickly to the violence instead of pulling back a little bit and seeing it in this context of piety and faith and prayer. That might be, I guess, more difficult to capture artistically, but I think the main reason is it's just not as, intriguing or salacious or something like that. But that's one of the reasons why she was so lauded in the Catholic tradition for so long, right? Chaste exemplar, likened to Mary, right, in a lot of prayers.
All right, one more.
Thank you very much.